Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your Sunday night to join us. My name is Shelby Leiding. I'm a registered psychologist with Tasha Vielik's Psychology. I've had the pleasure of being able to work with Tasha for a couple years now and also did my graduate practicum under her. So the practice is really close to my heart, and it's really exciting to be able to touch base with folks who are involved with us. I also wanted to share a little bit with you about my sort of experience in general, because it really relates to the topic that we're going to be discussing tonight. So aside from the work that I do with Tasha, I also work full-time in a treatment program for at-risk youth and adolescents. And so kids who are sort of in that really deep end of the pool in terms of things that are going on for them. So some really serious issues, criminal justice involvement, lots of big things like that. So I feel really lucky that I have the privilege to sort of see the wide spectrum of risk taking and what it looks like, and at what points we do want to take some action or be worried about it. So jumping in tonight, I called this module or my presentation "Walking the Middle Path." And Walking the Middle Path is a module from a therapy that's called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. And it's a really cool therapy because it focuses on this philosophy called dialectics, which is a really fancy word for essentially looking at how two seemingly opposite things can be true at the same time. And that's a really tough thing for us to wrap our heads around, because our brains don't like to think that way. Our brains like things to be really clear and organized and honestly kind of efficient. And so, we often think in terms of good, bad, winning, losing, right versus wrong. It's really easy to kind of, put situations and people into those categories. And what dialectics really forces us to do is to kind of get uncomfortable and to sit in that gray zone a little bit, where, maybe there's two perspectives, one that we perhaps agree with more than another, but can we find a way to see that they're both true and they're both valuable? And so this is a particularly useful way of thinking when it comes to adolescence and parenting. Because the beauty of being able to think that way is, for one, like I said, it facilitates perspective taking, empathy. The second thing it does, though, which is really important, is it kind of teaches us to think critically. And I think if there's one thing we can all agree on, especially in this day and age, is that we want young people to know how to do this, to not jump to conclusions, but to really think things through, to consider different points of view. And the third thing it does is that it really enables us to solve problems creatively. When we can get outside the box of I'm right or you're wrong, it opens up this world of possibilities. And, it's sort of similar in that we really want our young people to be able to solve problems effectively and creatively, and perhaps better than previous and current generations are managing things. So that's kind of my preamble to why I wanted to share this with you tonight, because I think it really does apply to teen risk taking, and especially when it comes to parenting and figuring out how do you get on the same page with a kid who's maybe going off the rails a bit, or who you're worried about. So with that being said, let's jump in. So this slide is kind of talks about the different dilemmas that we might see. And this is the way that the middle path conceptualizes them. So as a parent, and it's not even just parenting, this could apply to teachers or coaches or really anyone who has influence with young people, is we kind of get stuck in these places. And you can almost imagine that it's this teeter-totter where we're constantly questioning, am I being too strict? Am I being too loose? Do I need to tighten up and be more firm, or do I need to just kind of let it go? And the next one is, fostering dependence versus encouraging independence. And this one is a little trickier, and I actually wanted to touch on it a little bit because I think Mel is going to be speaking to this in her talk coming up, which will be more in the context of anxiety, but it is really challenging as adults to figure out, is this something that this young person really needs us to kind of support them and sort of, pull them closer, maybe give them some reassurance and some additional help? Or is this a time where we need to kind of step back and say, I think you got it, kid. That's a tough call to make. And the final dilemma, which is the one that I'm going to be focusing on the most tonight, is making light of problem behavior, so not taking things seriously enough, versus making too much of typical behavior. And that's a really tricky one, because I think particularly for teens in this day and age, how the heck does anybody know what's typical anymore? We all kind of know, well, with a 2-year-old, it's pretty typical for them to have temper tantrums, or it's pretty typical for a 2-year-old to say no, or to not be very good at sharing. We kind of have a bit more of a clear roadmap on what that looks like. But with teens right now, it's so challenging. And I think part of it is because never before has that generation of young people had access to so much space where there aren't adults around, and that's primarily digital. So there's chat rooms, video games, they're on social media, they're making videos. There's this whole world that is happening where they're connecting with their peers and the world at large that the adults who know them really well don't necessarily play a role in. And so then it does kind of create some distance, and it's a little bit harder to judge where our kids at, what do they need, what's going on. So moving forward, the kind of, I want to share this slide first of all, because this is kind of like the end game of finding the middle path. And then I'm going to break it down about how do we get there. But really, the solution to some of these challenges, particularly when it comes to teens who are displaying some really, concerning, risky behaviors, is we want to find ways to do, sort of these 3 things where we can have really clear rules and still be flexible and be able to negotiate, where we can address problems and take action when we need to, and we're also capable of letting things go. And finally, where we can give nurturing and support and comfort, and give freedom and choices, and allow kids to sort of own their own mistakes and responsibilities. And this is really, really tricky. And I don't think it's ever a place that anybody arrives at perfectly. I think it's always adjusting. And again, thinking of that teeter totter, and we're constantly, okay, do I move forward? Do I move back? Where's the balance right now? So to help us get there, I wanted to sort of challenge everyone tonight. And this is a really kind of dialectical way of thinking, if you will, is I want to challenge you to remove the word but from your vocabulary. When we use that word, but, it often, whether we mean it to or not, can kind of invalidate the thing that comes before the but. So, in some of the examples I've shared here, like, yes, you get choices, but I get to do this. It can be kind of dismissive, and it can, again, sort of reinforce this polarization of you versus me, or us versus them. Instead, I want to challenge you to choose yes and, where this is that pull here, where both things can be true. So yes, kid, you have a right to privacy. I know it's really uncomfortable when I'm looking through your phone to see what you're doing, and I have a job to keep you safe. So both of these things can be true. And that's kind of what I'm going to get into here is when you have that yes and approach, it suddenly opens up so much more space for your young person to feel heard, to feel like you get it, and for you to also be able to share your perspective and your concerns, and to have a bit more room to do some negotiation around boundaries and limits. So let's jump right in then to this dilemma of what is typical adolescent behavior. And I've kind of included, some of the general things here, which I think most people, we kind of know appear cognitively, and it's kind of like, yeah, it's normal for teens to be more moody or for there to be more arguing. But when it comes to what that behavior looks like, when it's happening right in front of you, that's a whole different ballgame, especially when it's, a kid that you really care about. And so this is kind of where I wanted to normalize, I think, some of the things that are happening now, some of the themes that I know I'm seeing. And, when we have our consultations as groups, as clinicians at Tasha's practice, we do talk about these things. And there's lots of stuff coming up around, right now, there's a lot more kids that are presenting with some mood related challenges. So kids who are feeling pretty low, kids who are feeling really anxious, and, part of that's probably COVID. There's also a lot more experimentation with vaping. That's a big thing. Lots more, drive to be online. It was quite funny, but this was even 6 months ago. I had a 9-year-old kind of march into my office, and she said, "Shelby, I need you to do something for me." And I went, "Okay, kid, what do you need?" "I need you to tell my mom that I need TikTok." And I was like, whoa, this kid is 9. And that was, what this young person really wanted. And so that just kind of shows us, I think, that, again, teen culture is shifting a little bit. So some things that are normal is honestly some experimentation with style, with friends, with interests, with substances, with sex. Some increased social stress is really normal. This desire for privacy and kind of pulling away from parents and like, "Oh, mom," those pieces are very typical. It's also typical for kids to be staying up later. Teenagers, their sleep cycle does shift a little bit. And so, that's something that we've got to adjust to. But kind of, the two pieces that I really wanted to focus on, and it's because there's things that have popped up a lot. One of the things that parents often, I think, where we get stuck is around this increased argumentativeness or pushback that happens in adolescence. And I really want to validate that it's hard, it's unpleasant. And if your kid is pushing back and kind of challenging you on stuff, you're doing something right. Because ultimately we want young people to grow into adults who can say no to a boss, or who can say no to their peers, who aren't afraid to question authority or challenge injustice. And the safest place for them to kind of flex that muscle is with the people who love them the most. So that is something that it's so painful and hard, and it is so good if it's happening in your home, of course, in respectful ways. And that's, we can get into that where some of the teaching happens. But the other piece that is kind of interesting to me is, a lot of times parents will say, "Oh, like I caught her, she came home and she had a vape in her backpack," or, "We caught her on the security cam sneaking out." And I kind of want to say to them, perfect. If you are catching your teen and some of that stuff, that's good, because ultimately we don't want teens to learn how to be sneaky. We kind of want them to be bad at that, actually, so that we do know a bit more about what's going on. So, if there's room for there to be conversation around some of that stuff, if you're catching teens doing things that they shouldn't be doing, again, it's frustrating. Maybe it's a little bit alarming. It's also a really, really good thing, because it's an opportunity to intervene and to have a conversation about it. So the next thing, of course, now is we want to look at that other side of the teeter-totter, where are things not so typical? And here I kind of wanted to talk about how we can have these sort of not typical, really concerning behaviors that kind of exist in these two different worlds. And the one world is, I like to think of it as the chaos world. And so that might be, there's these really volatile moods, things are going up and down. Maybe you've got a kid who's, skipping classes, or there's some really concerning substance use, or staying up all night, or kind of being really verbally aggressive, it's chaos. And it's kind of easy to identify that, because it often, creates chaos for the people around this kind of young person. But the other kind of really concerning behavior is actually when things get too rigid. And so here I'm talking about the really, perfectionist kind of kid who never, steps a toe over the line, who never pushes back, who doesn't take risks. And that is also really, really worrying to me, because, that's where we see kids start to float into these things like, more serious anxiety related problems, or disordered eating, or some obsessions. And so both sides have their own set of problems. Unfortunately, one is a little bit, I think, tends to kind of get ignored because it's easier to deal with as adults. The kids that aren't pushing back, they do kind of fly under the radar until it kind of jumps up and smacks us in the face that something really serious is going on. But just wanted to put that out there that, if you have kind of this really easy kid, it's something to keep your eye on, because that might not always mean that things are great underneath the surface. But as you can see with this list, there's a really wide range of things where we want to get worried about. And this is by no means even close to an exhaustive list of when we want to think of things as not being so typical. So I kind of created this little sort of formula for thinking about, how do we judge when we need to be worried? And so again, that first thing is kind of identifying, is there a lot of chaos going on? Is there, rigidity? And, how is it impacting the young person? How is it impacting the family? So once we've identified those two things, then we go to this question around daily functioning. What is the impact? And so is it impacting a young person's sleep, their grades, their friendships, their activities? Are they not doing things they like to do anymore? Are they hanging out with a totally different group and getting into stuff that they've never been interested in before? That kind of impaired daily functioning, that's sort of the benchmark that goes along with, every diagnosis out there, is really, we want to know, what is the impact? And so that's kind of that second benchmarker. And then finally, of course, there's, we're looking at dangerous consequences. And I really wanted to point out that dangerous consequences, here I'm talking about safety, more immediate concerns where we do need to take action right away. It's really easy, though, I think, as parents and as people who care about young people, for us to be able to jump to the worst conclusion sometimes, or to see, how a single incident can, we start flying, this is going to continue 5 years down the road. She's not going to go to university, or she's going to end up on the streets, right? It's really easy to kind of go down the rabbit hole. And that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about more immediate, pretty scary stuff that we need to keep our eyes on. To give you an example, there's the kid who maybe you get a notification that, oh, hey, your daughter wasn't in math class today. And it's the third time this week she's missed class. And it's like, what's going on? And you find out she's been hanging out with her friends in the parking lot vaping. Not cool. Definitely conversation, consequences, but dangerous? No. And so that's kind of where, for people to be able to differentiate a little bit around that, we want to make sure that our reaction matches what the young person is doing. Because sometimes what happens, I think, is, again, as the grownups, we get scared, rightfully so, because we are using our fully formed upstairs brains to, see through ahead to consequences. But when that happens, young people often, they start to get better. And this is what I was saying before, they start to get better at being sneaky, because the reaction feels so intense or so alarming, or it feels like they feel so guilty about it or so ashamed that I just can't tell my mom or dad that I did this thing, or that this is what's happening. And that's a situation that we want to avoid. So that's why I really wanted to point out that, dangerous consequences are hopefully really rare. But, kind of using these benchmarks. And so now kind of wanted to jump into, what do you do if you are concerned about your kid? And how do we sort of navigate through some of that? So the next slide here is, I wanted to talk about this way of solving problems collaboratively. And this is not a DBT skill necessarily, but it's actually its own thing. And I think it fits really well with this topic, because we really want to break down, how do you and your young person find common ground, and sort of avoid these power struggles that ultimately lead to everybody getting hurt and nothing really changing. So the first step is validation. Validation is going to be one of your most useful tools that you can have in your tool belt as somebody who cares about young people. But it's really important to know what it is. And oftentimes when I have a conversation with a parent or a teacher or someone, they have a lot of concerns about validation. Oftentimes they're worried about, well, if I validate their feelings, then I'm saying it's okay for them to treat me badly, or I'm giving them permission to do this thing that I don't think they should be doing, or I'm kind of excusing their bad behavior. And I really want to make clear that that is not what validation is. It's not agreeing with somebody. It's not excusing bad behavior. It's not giving permission. What it is really acknowledging that you understand how someone is feeling. You can kind of go, okay, I see how you got there. Even if I disagree with it, even if I think, maybe your thinking is a little funky here, I can see how you got there. That's what it is. And that's where it ends. It's, we're not talking necessarily about validating, choices or things that we disagree with. We just want to know, how did somebody get to where they are? What happened that you got there? And so your best weapons, I want to say, when it comes to validation is really knowing, okay, what can you validate? What are the valid things? And so these are often internal experiences. Feelings are generally always valid. It's really hard to disagree with how somebody's feeling. Thoughts, for the most part, are valid. How somebody's experiencing something, what their worries or their fears are, what their needs, their desires. These things can be valid. And to give you a couple of examples of this, because I know that it's a little bit hard, again, to put it into practice with that young person in front of you. So here's a couple of statements. I can understand why you think I'm comparing you to your sister because I talked a lot about how well she did on her test last week. That's validation, even though in your mind, you're like, I would never compare you to your sister. I love all my children differently. And that might be what wants to come out of your mouth. But if that's the response to your young person who has just accused you of comparing you to their sibling, the conversation then ends there. And so validation is, being able to pause, okay, I can understand why you feel really pressured to get good grades because we've talked a lot about needing that to get into university. That's kind of what I'm talking about here is, can you make sense of how they got to where they are? And so here is more of a breakdown around what are the steps? How do you do this thing called validation? And the first one is the hardest one. It's listening and literally zipping our mouths, hitting the pause button, kind of swallowing our instant reaction and just listen and getting curious. Curiosity is a beautiful tool because it not only is going to help you ensure that your adolescent feels heard, feels like you're interested in them, like you want to know, it also buys you time to think and to organize your thoughts. If you can keep them kind of talking and telling you what's going on, you can kind of calm yourself down a bit. So it's really lovely that it can be kind of mutually beneficial there. But some great questions, and one of my favorites is just, can you help me understand? Can you help me make sense of this? What is happening right now? And then once you feel like you kind of have it, then you can take a stab at, okay, yeah, this makes sense. It makes sense you feel angry that I took your phone away because that's how you connect with your friends. Totally get it. And the final piece to validation is, this nurturing component where we're able to, that sounds really hard, or thank you for sharing with me. And there's a connection that happens there. And so one of the beautiful things about this process is that validation, again, it does a few things, like I said, it buys you some time to kind of organize your thoughts and think a little bit. It makes your adolescent feel really heard. It builds attachment. These are the small moments where we feel really seen and we feel like somebody gets us. That's when we feel most connected. So you're building attachment. And the other thing that it's doing is it actually regulates our brain. Validation and kind of that empathy, that experience of somebody else feeling what we feel, it calms us down. And so if you have a young person who's really upset or they're really mad, or, you want to solve a problem, we all know that trying to do that when somebody's in that state is not going to be very productive. And so this tool is going to help you calm them down and get them to a place where then you can do some of that teaching and limit setting and exploration of boundaries. So the next step after we've kind of done some of this validation is then we want to really explore, okay, what is the problem? And if we're thinking about risk taking and what's happening, some of the conversations I've had with parents lately are about clothing. So kids who kind of want to wear some things that parents feel are really inappropriate or they feel uncomfortable with, being out late, curfew, some of your more typical teenage stuff. And so again, what we're trying to avoid here is this problem between, that we don't want to make the kid the problem, or it's your behavior that's the problem, it's you that's breaking the rules, because then again, we're going to be locked into that power struggle. So the idea here is, how can we both come around to be on the same team so that the problem is the problem and it's not us, either one of us. And so again, the first step is get really curious. What's the hardest part about me taking your phone away? Like, why does that really, really upset you? Or, yeah, what's the hardest part about all of this for you? You want to validate their perspective. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I can see why that part is really hard for you. And now you get to share your perspective. So my problem with this is, I feel really worried when you're out past dark. Or, when you're not going to bed on time, I know you can't get up on time, and that's a problem for me. And then we can kind of frame it as, so our problem, so again, we're a team, our problem is that you need to spend time with your friends and I need to know you're safe. Or, you want to connect with your friends on social media and I need to make sure that you're getting a good night's rest. Does that kind of make sense for folks in terms of how do we sort of get so that we're both on the same team when it comes to some of this stuff? And the final step in this process is really the invitation. And so this is where, okay, we've done the validation, we've hopefully calmed people down. We've kind of got a clearer idea of what is our problem right now, where's the conflict. And now is where we want to see, what can we do with it? This is where we get to use some of that critical thinking and that creative problem solving, that dialectics is, how do we come together in the middle of our teeter-totter here? And so this is the invitation. I wonder if we can come up with something that works for both of us. I wonder if, that's one of my favorite ones. I wonder if, or, what ideas do you have? How do you think we can make this work for us so that you feel good and I feel good? And that's when, I would encourage you to maybe invite your kid to shout out some ideas and have it, in the back of your mind that this is brainstorming, because I'm sure some of their ideas are going to be ridiculous. You should let me have my phone at all times and never say no to me ever. Okay, that's a great idea. I don't think it's going to fly, but thanks for putting one out there. What else can you come up with, right? And so that's okay. You can kind of laugh about it a little bit. Go into it with the attitude that you're going to negotiate. What is the middle ground? And again, knowing that just for ourselves, we're more likely to be willing to give some ground if we feel like we're getting something in return. And so this is a process of sort of mutual reward and reinforcement. And you can challenge your kid around that too. One of my favorite things to say to young people is, okay, convince me that this is what, I should say yes to, or convince me that this is going to be a good choice for you. And you're kind of, you're giving them some control, some ownership in that. Once you have sort of landed on something that feels doable, write it down. It is going to be so helpful down the road, because guaranteed, a week later, it's going to come up and, well, you said this and you said that. And well, actually, we have it written down. This is what we both agreed on. And, and we can come back to it and we can revisit it and decide, is this actually working? One thing I want to point out is I've kind of laid this process out in a nice linear fashion. In real life, probably not going to work that way. It's really normal, especially when we're talking about the problem, for people to get upset and for emotions to get high. You might have to pause. You might have to circle back to the validation stage. You might have to say, okay, you know what? I need to sleep on this for a night. Tomorrow we're going to talk. That's okay. This doesn't have to happen in a 15-minute process. I do promise one thing, though, is that the more consistently you practice it, the easier it is, for you to do, and the better you and your young person are going to get at solving these problems together. So some final kind of thoughts that I wanted to share and stuff is, I think there's this misconception, again, kind of this black and white thinking that we tend to fall into, is that if I'm setting limits with my young person, or if I'm saying no to them, then I'm not loving them and supporting them. If it hurts them, it's not good for them. Or if I make them upset, I've done something wrong. And I really wanted to kind of debunk that myth, because you can be loving and nurturing, and you can be really firm when you have to be, and you can set really clear expectations. And in fact, really clear, consistent, high expectations, that's what kids thrive on. They thrive when they know where the bar is. They know what's expected of them. They know that the expectations don't change day to day. They're the same as at home as they are at school. That creates such an incredible sense of predictability for young people. So it is really, really okay to say no. And that's where that validation piece comes in, is, yeah, kid, I'm saying no because I have to do what's best for you. And I really hear that sucks and you're really mad at me right now. You can validate that. The other piece of this is don't be afraid to get it wrong. Attachment is just like, strengthening muscles, where we kind of expect these muscle fibers to sort of rip and then they build back together and they're stronger. That is how attachment is built. It's these little mini ruptures and repairs where, we have a disagreement, things kind of blow up and, hopefully not to a point where things are seriously ruptured, but, can we come back? And as the adult, what a beautiful gift you're giving to that young person in your life to come back to them and to say, hey, I really lost my cool there. I'm really sorry that I yelled at you and I said those things. I wish I didn't say that. That's incredible because you're modeling accountability. And now, you've given your young person a standard for them to hold themselves accountable to their choices. The final thought too is, especially when it comes to risk taking, different families have different thresholds for risk, and that's okay. What is the most important though is that you are really, really clear about what your what hill are you going to die on, and choose them wisely and make sure that your young person knows what those hills are, and that's made really clear as they enter into some of these situations and circumstances where that might be challenged. Because what makes it, I think, really hard is, and I've seen it sort of go both ways, where we kind of get locked into this thing where we feel like we have to pick every hill, and you get exhausted because it becomes this sort of no-win situation where you're constantly at loggerheads with your young person. So I would challenge you to find places where you can be more flexible. You want to color your hair, okay, color, it's pink, I don't like it, that's all right, we can let that go. But I'm not okay with you staying out past 10 o'clock. Where are those non-negotiables for you, and what are those family values? And it's really important, especially if you're parenting with someone else, whether it's in the same home or a different one, that those are the same across environments. And it's really important that, as the adults, that you're on the same page when it comes to some of that stuff with young people. Finally, talking about some of this, I was talking to a mom the other day, and it was really a tough conversation because we were talking about validation. And this light bulb went off for me because I realized, as adults, we're human beings too, and we want to be validated. And it's really, really tough going into conversations with young people, knowing that sometimes that's not going to be reciprocated and that we can't necessarily expect that of them. That's not their job to validate us in that way. It's really important then that you as the adult and the caregiver, that you have people in your world who are validating you and supporting you. And yeah, I get it. This kid is really complex. This is so hard. I'm really sorry your family's going through this. You need that. We can't put that on young people though, to give that to us in the same way that we provide it to them. And so removing that expectation, I'm hopeful kind of decreases some of the arousal and the frustration that happens with these conversations, because it is essentially, like Tasha was talking about last week, that brain isn't fully wired yet. And so in a lot of ways, you as the adult who's doing some of this process with them, you are that big upstairs brain. You're helping them regulate, you're helping them solve problems, you're validating them and soothing them. That's a big job, and it's tiring and it's hard, but it is, I think, really possible. I'm hopeful that this information tonight was helpful for people. I know that there is some scary stuff out there for sure for young people, and I would really encourage you to watch Tasha's talk from last week. She kind of dives into more of the neurobiology around risk-taking and dopamine and ways that we can sort of redirect some of that stuff that happens in adolescence, which I think is a huge piece. Finally, I thought I would share some resources, and these are some great websites, books, a couple of, some of the websites have some great videos on there. So the Mental Health Foundations.ca has some wonderful videos, especially on how do you validate anger. That's a tricky one, stuff like that. So I'd really encourage you to take a look at them.